Hi, I'm Professor Katerina Hertog. I'm an associate professor in AI and society here at the YI. To everyone online and in the room, welcome to Innovation and Decolonization, Decolonizing cutting-edge machine learning and natural language processing advancements in non-Western contexts. We are delighted to have Linda Cheng with us today to discuss the importance of adapting machine learning and natural language processing innovations to non-Western contexts, focusing on their social impacts. Linda Hong Cheng is an award-winning researcher and public speaker, computational sociology PhD researcher, and Clarendon Scholar here at Oxford, and YI Fellow at Columbia University. Linda is the founding director of Girl Plane, an art tech startup dedicated to uplifting women artists and revolutionizing creative spaces through groundbreaking exhibitions and summits at the cutting edge of art, tech, academia, and business, and the co-founding CEO of Hmong, the world's first AI-driven age tech startup dedicated to making digital tech inclusive of all ages. At Oxford, Linda's research grapples with the contentious relationship between gender and tech, focusing on global digital gaps, social demographic trends, and contentious politics using novel computational methods. At For your awareness, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our website following the event. The presentation will run for about 30 to 40 minutes, followed by discussion at the end. If you are joining us online, please put your questions into the Q&A box, and those in the room save your questions until the end, and Linda will answer them after the talk. If you're online and wish to ask questions with your mic on, please raise your hand during the Q&A session and we'll call on you. Be aware that this will then be included in the recording. It's great to have you here, Linda. We're very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, that was a long introduction, but my name is Linda, and today I'll be presenting on innovation decolonization. So talking about decolonizing machine learning, natural language processing for non-Western contexts. And so this is based on an Oxford handbook chapter I wrote about 2 years ago at Columbia University. So just a little bit about me. The introduction was amazing. So right now I'm a computational sociology PhD at Nuffield College, researching digital gender circularity. I'm really interested in tech and gender and how tech can be an empowering force for marginalized communities, particularly women. And also I am the founder and director of Girl Pain. So we are an art tech collective dedicated to uplifting women artists, sort of at the cutting edge of art and tech, so integrating AI and sort of AR, VR into our exhibitions and really disrupting how a lot of these elitist art institutions display art. And then I also am the co-founder and CEO of Hmong, which is an age tech startup dedicated to making e-commerce platforms accessible and inclusive of non-digital natives, especially older people. And you can find me on Instagram, LinkedIn, etc. And so I guess, one of the first things I want to sort of define is what is tech for good? What is innovation? What is decolonization? We don't often see these terms next to tech. What does this mean? So the context is that ML, machine learning and natural language processing methods, they're innovating at a pace more rapid than we can keep up with. Right. And so we have to ensure that these methods are developed equitably and inclusively for all communities, right? Because a lot of the people at the top of these tech corporations who are in control of our data and these new models aren't necessarily representative of, the entire population. And these methods and algorithms that are being applied to everything from medicine to jobs, they affect our everyday lives. A lot of times the algorithms are a black box and they're being tested on data that's inherently biased, right? And so decolonization is what I, would term the justice-informed transformation of tech for the good of all, particularly marginalized communities. And so the larger sort of driving theme of this work that I'm presenting today, and also all the work that I do, is algorithmic justice in tech for good. And so as we see these rapid innovations in generative AI and natural language processing and sentiment analysis in just the last 10 years alone, and keep in mind, I wrote this, handbook chapter 2 years ago. And so, since then there have been extremely, rapid innovations in LLMs, right? But these arguments, they remain really relevant, despite having DeepSeek, which is from China, ChatGPT, they're obviously extremely good at processing different kinds of languages, but the algorithms that they're based on and founded upon, they're still quite biased. And they still have trouble processing, a lot of different kinds of languages, not just Chinese, but, including classical Chinese, including a lot of these, languages that deserve to be represented. And so AI and NLP sentiment now, they have completely revolutionized applications within the social sciences. They can analyze huge amounts of unstructured social media data, which I'm sure all of you here at the OI are very familiar with, right? And one example and sort of an inspiration for this paper was another paper that I was first author of, which was my thesis at Columbia University, looking at basically media and government attention to protest events in China using Weibo data. And in the process of processing, all of this social media data, with a lot of text data in Chinese, I noticed how difficult it was to apply natural language processing sentiment analysis, structural, equation models to these unstructured texts that weren't in English, right? It was extremely difficult because these NLP frameworks, they're not made for non-European languages, which was an issue that I thought about and I wanted to sort of write about and do something about. And so a lot of the methodological limitations of machine learning applications to social media data, it isn't just in the linguistic sphere, it also applies to the political context of that country. And so since I was doing China specifically, there's a lack of control for censorship within these machine learning applications, right? And of course, natural language processing, they're not suitable for Chinese language texts, really troublingly so. So we can talk about censorship first. So there's a really complex nature of internet data. It's obviously extremely messy, and in the Chinese context, it's even more interesting because there's censorship, right? There's self-censorship, and then there's also government censorship. And of course, censorship is not unique to China, but there are particularities within that country's framework. And so there's a lot of debate on the accuracy and reliability of unstructured internet data. Right. And this Chinese context, it adds a lot of ethical, representative, and censorship complexities that we have to sort of control for when we're applying NLP methods, when we're analyzing unstructured data, and when our analyses can have really important implications for social policy, for how we understand country context, and obviously for the development of bigger models that are being trained on these. So in China, the evolution of censorship has been quite interesting. So there have been shifts from really heavy-handed restrictions to more subtle public opinion guidance. And social media often does target posts that are talking about mobilizing for offline protests, which is really interesting. So Professor King at Stanford, she does a lot of interesting work about sort of reverse engineering, censorship policies in China applied to social media protest. And what she found was that actually, contrary to a lot of mainstream Western reports, what is being censored is not, ideological. So if you say you hate the government, it has actually a lesser chance of being censored than if you're saying, let's go out today and let's mobilize or let's unionize today, right? Because one of them doesn't really have an actual effect, whereas the other one has an actual effect on social stability. And there is a really important global relevance to understanding and being really cognizant of these Chinese particularities. Not only because obviously China is a rapidly growing country, but also because it represents something more important, which is the representativeness of non-Western languages in these models, right? But going back to the Chinese particularities, there's really uneven and fragmented implementation across platforms of censorship due to what we call commercialized censorship. And so, for one example is there are lots of different social media companies in China. So Weibo is one of the biggest ones. And Weibo actually disobeyed 16% of state directives to, in order to stay competitive with Tongxun or Tencent platforms in China, which controls WeChat, for instance, right? So censorship is not a really unitized or really unitary sort of policy. It's not blanket covering everything. It is really fractured. And there are also self-censorship dynamics on social media, right? So, oftentimes citizens might avoid sensitive topics or keywords. They might use different terms to replace them in order to evade censorship, and even particularly, online bullying, which is, has become something that's really been a, big attention in China. One example, cyberbullying, right? And it highlights risks to marginalized groups, LGBT, women especially, and there have been lots of cases. And the implications of this for social science research is that this complicates data analysis in computational sociology, in the social sciences, and we have to consider for the censored content to avoid biased findings. And then moving on to really the crux of this argument is Chinese language particularities. So unlike European and alphabetic languages, Chinese does not necessitate the use of spaces to outline words in terms, right? So if you've ever have been familiar with Chinese, or if you see it, there are no spaces between different words. And the meanings implication of Chinese terms, it can change depending on the textual context, and they're really entirely context dependent for interpretation, which is why it's also one of, if not the most difficult language to master. And Chinese is also extremely rich and embedded with really ancient cultural, historical, classical references that are really hard to find equivalences in European languages, right? So what does this mean? It means that that NLP is extremely hard to apply to Chinese, and it also means that in that case, there's a lack of representation for the Chinese language in these, really basic models that are feeding into larger AI models, right? And that's problematic. And so what I propose in the handbook chapter is a new cutting edge subfield that I term Chinese computational sociology. So it's at the sort of intersections of sociology, machine learning, and NLP methods in China studies, where a lot of scholars, who are Chinese and who aren't, are applying these cutting edge methods to studying social issues within a more Chinese centric and non-Western centric lens. And a lot of these scholars also are touching on, the challenges of applying natural language processing to the Chinese language. And so, going into more technical terms, right? Eurocentric bias NLP means that tokenization, POS tagging, NER, analysis and topic modeling, they embed assumptions of European languages. They're very ill-suited for Chinese, which is something that I noticed when I was doing my own research using sentiment analysis. And the contextual dependence and absence of spaces in Chinese, it defies a lot of these traditional NLP methods. And so the key barriers that I noticed in my research was that the absence of spaces between words, it really complicates tokenization and word boundary detection. So oftentimes, researchers or for me, I had to add in several extra steps to be able to analyze Chinese text through NLP models. And then contextual dependence also alters meanings. So it challenges POS tagging in sentiment analysis, right? And so this also adds another sort of layer of analysis that we need to do in order to make existing really Eurocentric NLP models applicable to Chinese, right? And obviously this isn't just Chinese, but I'm just focusing on this language. And then additionally, rich cultural and historical references, they lack equivalence in European languages, and so this impacts topic modeling and translation for sure, right? Especially if you're talking about, in the political context, social context, idioms are used, like ancient Chinese idioms are used to describe, sociopolitical realities. And this isn't being translated, it isn't being tagged properly, it isn't being understood properly, and this can lead to a lot of, really strong bias in conclusions being drawn about, the society and also the political atmosphere. And this is very wordy, but there are a lot of existing advancements that are quite promising, but they're still sort of inadequate for addressing a lot of the issues that I see in NLP. So some of the advancements include word segmentation innovations, right? So there are tools like Dieba and Fudan NLP that add artificial spaces to adapt Chinese to Eurocentric frameworks. And so what Fudan NLP does is it actually detects terms, and then it'll just add a space in between terms when we're processing the data so that it can be sort of fed through the NLP frameworks. But like I said before, it's an extra step that we have to take. There's also an alternative, which is a Chinese character-based model, which actually outperforms word-based approaches. And so this is making sort of, I would say, an attempt at revising on existing models to make it more suitable for the linguistic framework of Chinese, right? And so these are dictionary-based solutions. And then there are other kinds of innovations like, word character LSTM models that reduce segmentation errors. And what that means is basically, when you're segmenting different, characters or tokens in a natural language processing text or corpus, it increases the accuracy because it's trained on a better test data set. Right. And then, character-based parsers, they can unify segmentation and tagging for improved accuracy, which is quite technical, but it's sort of in the same sphere where it's trying to revise upon existing frameworks in a way that is more suitable for the Chinese language because of its particularities. And then in the grammar and context sphere, you see sentiment analysis, topic and syntax, advancements. So for instance, pre-trained language models like BERT and McBERT, which address context-dependent emotional nuances in Chinese. And so here we're actually, what this is a larger theme of is improving test data sets that existing NLP models are trained on, which is one sort of larger avenue for sort of revising or correcting biased AI models, right? And then, topic and syntax, we have rule-based, sentiment methods, which outperform machine learning approaches in specific scenarios. And so in terms of specific scenarios, this is talking about, different kinds of contexts, like political context versus economic context. And it sort of echoes dictionary-based solutions where they make it more context-dependent. It might be addressing less so the root of the issue rather than sort of more of what you see when it's becoming realized in the process. And then, of course, there's blog emotion corpus aids for understanding emotional expressions. And this is a really interesting area of NLP as well, where it's sort of intersecting with psychology and cultural psychology to sort of add more context to sentiment analysis, to embed it into the language. And then in the area of language understanding, we have large-scale models, like the CPM, which is the largest Chinese pre-trained model that excels in language tasks with 2.6 billion parameters. So it's a huge, huge data set, right? And this again is going back to what I said before about changing test data sets to revise existing biased AI models. And then the toolkit like NLTP, which supports multitask Chinese NLP. With shared knowledge frameworks. So it's sharing a lot of frameworks and data sets with other existing sort of innovations. And then there, you have machine learning approaches, SVM, ARAM, which outperform existing, this is getting really technical, but, outperform KNN for messy and medium-sized data sets, which it does suggest a lot of potential for refining Chinese NLP applications, maybe from an actual sort of foundational starting point, rather than just correcting for cosmetic errors. But again, these are promising, but they're still inadequate to address the root of the problem. And their key limitations is that it relies on adapting Chinese to European NLP frameworks still, right? They're adding sort of different packages on top of existing frameworks, but the framework itself is still flawed. And it also introduces a lot of inefficiencies in the process. We find that scholars who want to analyze Chinese text, who want to understand Chinese sociopolitical issues, using the raw data, we have to go through several steps to be able to obtain the conclusion as compared to apply to, European, especially English language texts, right? Which is an inefficiency. It's also, it's an injustice. And then cultural and linguistic nuances of Chinese, they remain under-addressed in sentiment, syntax, and semantic analyses still. If you try to run sentiment analyses on classical Chinese texts or Chinese texts that don't really abide by language translations that can really be framed into an English context, it's extremely difficult. And then the development of fully localized, culturally attuned NLP tools, it remains a pressing need. And this is something that I'll talk about further. And so how can we transform machine learning and natural language processing methods so that they can be adapted to Chinese and also non-Western languages in general? Well, first we need to have a development of context-aware, culturally rooted natural language processing models, right? So in the Chinese context, we're talking about, Chinese-specific word banks, sentiment dictionaries created by local scholars through, and even though manual processes might risk arbitrariness. And this is, something that is a larger, framework of sort of localizing our data and localizing, the algorithms that are becoming embedded into our daily lives, right? It's sovereignty over models and algorithms. And related to that is do we have transformative emanations that are needed for tailoring machine translation to Chinese idioms and flexible syntax, leveraging deep learning to address dialectical and syntactic variations in Chinese. And I think we can add also that LLMs, they can also be helpful in the generation of new frameworks and code that can, go back to revise these really back-end sort of NLP and machine learning frameworks. And I think for researchers, we need to move beyond Eurocentric algorithms to reflect Chinese and non-Western linguistic and cultural realities, right? We need frameworks that center Chinese and non-Western voices in the creation of natural language processing frameworks to achieve nuanced insights. And we need to stop ignoring, non-Western linguistic diversity because it risks perpetuating inaccuracies in our research findings. And in research findings, they, especially at a place like Oxford, they have really, consequential, influence on policy, on larger mainstream understanding of how a society works, on many things that are much bigger than just us or the people that we know. It impacts entire communities and countries. And obviously, fair representation in computational models. It's essential for ethical global scale applications, right? And what this really speaks to is decolonizing knowledge systems as a whole. Because, like I mentioned before, that a lot of these frameworks, they're still based on quite biased data sets. And so the very basis upon which DeepSeek, ChatGPT, et cetera, they're tested and trained on and they're developed upon are data sets that represent, majority European and white male populations. And this is an issue that we see in every area of society, not just in tech, not just in NLP, right? And so when I talk about sort of localizing the creation of algorithms and data sets, it's really about taking back control of these innovations and shaping their direction. And really this connects, even on a larger level, and this is for developers, if we have any developers in the room, about global inclusivity, right? Because current algorithms, they prioritize European languages, they marginalize non-Western languages and cultures. We need to overcome this linguistic bias in order to enable global participation in natural language processing advancements. And this diversifies and also innovates existing and nascent AI technology as well. Right, algorithms optimized for Western syntax and semantics, they fail to capture, cultural subtleties in ingenuity, and that's just as simple as that. And we're losing out on innovation opportunities if we don't, take these steps to make change. Right, localized adaptive algorithms, they can meet the needs of, massively untapped global markets. And they also unlock unique features like, dialectical variation handling and culturally specific sentiment analysis. And these are really important, steps to take in order to really guarantee that we're innovating in a direction that is actually beneficial for social progress, which of course all of us here at the OII are extremely, thoughtful and really passionate about. And of course, ethical and social responsibility. We all have responsibility, especially if we're in the tech arena or if we are considering entering it, or if we're researchers sort of feeding into what is regulating the tech arena or et cetera, to create equitable technology that respects and includes all linguistic communities, and to reduce bias in AI systems, right? Because obviously that these frameworks, they're the basis of more advanced models. Because I was talking to a friend earlier, and we were talking about how even with DeepSeek, it's made in China, it actually still has problems processing a lot of ancient Chinese text, because the models that it's based on are biased. Models like the ones that I'm talking about here, which are more basic, AI sort of algorithms, right? And so everything sort of builds on top of each other. It's all quite cumulative. And that's exactly what I just mentioned, right? These existing language systems, all these algorithms we use, they're based on test data. And test data is drawn from historical data, right? It's drawn from history, and we have a history of social bias and oppression that sort of manifests itself in every arena in society, including tech. It's not unique to AI, but it definitely is amplified through AI because AI is such a powerful tool. And AI includes machine learning, includes NLP, it includes so many other things that we're seeing become more and more relevant in our daily lives. And so This is my call to action for everyone here. How do we solve these issues, right? Most of us are researchers. I think, being aware of these issues and working with local scholars to make corrections upon biased systems is really important. Being critical of issues like this in the research space is extremely relevant and consequential. But also, connecting your research to action, right? Join the Tech for Good space, right? And take more action to connect with people who are like-minded in the community, learning from local scholars of their own languages. And obviously follow Girl Pain and Meng's work as well. We're doing a lot in terms of reorienting tech for the good of society and really elevating and amplifying marginalized voices, right? And collaborate with non-Western linguists and sociologists and social scientists in general to address these gaps and integrate multilingual training data sets that prioritize linguistic and cultural diversity. And I know I just pointed out a lot of problems with AI and NLP, but I also want to sort of add that there's so much potential. There's so much liberating power to tech if it's developed in the right hands. And I was talking to Professor Hertog about this earlier, and recently I was talking to a friend who was a developer, and she was saying there was a story of an AI company that has been founded and is owned by Maori people, and they're indigenous to the Pacific Islands, and they are using AI to make their indigenous language more accessibly learnable for people in their community, right? And this is something that OpenAI, that Google, that Facebook cannot do. And I say that publicly because they don't have the ingenuity of people who this language is indigenous to them, and they have this deep emotional connection to it, right? I think a lot of times when we think about NLP, we think about computational methods, we think about AI or tech in general as an umbrella space. We always think of it as dominated by white men, and that's not true. We can take up space in these industries, and we can make change. And AI and tech shouldn't be for the elite, it should be for us. It can be democratized, and it really starts with obviously my research. It starts with you as well, right? Really learning more about tech for good, and digging deep into a lot of the action and community building that can be done to make this space more inclusive and to really make these powerful tools something that can be used for good rather than for harm. And that's exactly how I see the work I do for Girl Pain and Hmong as well, right? Girl Pain is about integrating art with tech, and people often think of tech, especially AI, as sort of contradictory to art, as destructive to art. And something that I really care about is that, letting people know that AI and tech does not have to be destructive. It does not have to be a zero-sum game. It can be collaboratory, whether it's in academia or in the industry. And I also wanted to advertise, I have an upcoming talk also talking about AI and queer communities. It will be in London on the 18th from 6 to 9 p.m. If anyone's interested, super welcome to attend. And that is me. Any questions?
Thank you. The chat as well. Yep. So like always, just to say, I'll monitor the digital chat. I'll call people in the room. If we get some people online, I will sort of take turns, but we don't have anyone yet. So please.
Thank you for sharing. So my question is, because I'm quite new to NLP and ML. So basically my question is, I can clearly tell how linguistics would be part of these actions, but how what's the role of the sociologist? How are they gonna be part of this to improve this situation?
I think that's a great question. I think social scientists have a particularly important role to play because we are really in tune with social issues, right? I mean, like the name says, right? And so we have, I would say, really unique context that a lot of times computer scientists and people who just work in tech don't. We have sort of a larger framework and vision for the role that tech plays in society, not just as something that is technical, right? That's just algorithms, but actually the impact that it has on human lives, and on communities. And I think that is priceless. And that's why, you know, in my article or in my chapter, I talk about Chinese computational sociology, because, you know, I think in a time and in a political era like this, with a lot of far-right movements, and people like Elon Musk and Zuckerberg sort of using tech in this really harmful, irresponsible way, that we draw from other areas of knowledge, and social science is really central to this, right? Because we have to understand tech as more than just algorithms. We need to understand how they affect the people that are using them, and also who is shaping the algorithms that are really, you know, perpetuating these injustices that are having so much power over people's lives. If you just think about AI in hospitals, for instance, or in hiring, in determining who gets probation, you know, convicts and things like that, these are so consequential. And if, you know, social scientists aren't at the fore of this, who will be, right? And so the short answer is that we're absolutely essential.
Thank you.
Yeah, Ralph?
Yeah, I think this is great, and there's a lot of really interesting insights. But I want to kind of press you on 2 points. One is that ancient Chinese, and there should be more focus on NLP on ancient Chinese. Ancient Chinese, the texts that we have are incredibly patriarchal, just because of who wrote the text. And of course, ancient China was enslaving all sorts of neighboring populations. And, you know, one of the reasons for saying that is that I think, you know, if we want to understand ancient Chinese texts, you might make the argument, well, what about ancient Greek or Roman texts? You know, they were very Eurocentric, but do we really want NLP to engage with those, given that they were also incredibly patriarchal and written by rich white males who owned slaves and so on? I think that's one part of the picture. So I think, you know, I wasn't sure how you were putting China into this picture, which also applies to the European context. On the other hand, you said, well, we need to think about markets and, you know, how NLP enable markets. But I find that curious to talk about that in this particular context, because my own sense from looking at the AI industry in China, quite apart from DeepSeek, is that I'm not sure that China will have much of a problem developing NLP for markets, given that there's so much money to be made, and given that, you know, China has so many innovative companies in computer science, and, you know, so many innovative companies that are making a lot of money and that are possibly in line for being more profitable than many American companies.
No, thank you so much for those questions. So I wanted to clarify for the first question. I don't think that NLP should be oriented around ancient Chinese. I was raising ancient Chinese as an example because a lot of classical Chinese is actually still used in modern, you know, linguistic contexts today, right? So a lot of ancient proverbs and idioms that are used today to refer to socioeconomic issues by, you know, contemporary people today. And so not being able to understand those idioms because they're rooted in ancient Chinese is really limiting for us to be able to, you know, really wholly analyze Chinese society. And obviously this applies not just to China. I think it's important that all languages are being represented in NLP frameworks, because NLP is such a powerful tool for analyzing society today, especially as we see everyone's lives, everything is on social media these days. You can't even avoid it. And so for social scientists and for developers alike, if we are not, you know, having the frameworks that are necessary to really equally and equitably analyze the test data that, you know, is representative of global populations, we're biasing, you know, bias, is that a word? We're making, you know, bias in new algorithms, right? And that's extremely problematic. And to the second point about global markets, I was not referring to China when talking about sort of how NLP can open global markets. I was referring more to how you know, diversity and you know, equitable inclusion isn't it's not contradictory to making money. And I know that can be controversial, right? Because I also, you know, have a lot of sympathy with Marxism, but with a lot of these companies, a lot of these, I think, you know, the tech space, there's definitely a profit motive. And I think something that's important to emphasize is that, you know, equity and inclusion can actually help you make profits at the same time as benefiting communities, right? And it really is just about where these profits, where the benefits of these algorithms are being distributed. If we're using data from marginalized communities, then obviously they should be, you know, paid for it. They should, you know, have some kind of, you know, compensation structure, and it shouldn't be exploited from them, which goes into sort of larger points about data sovereignty and algorithmic justice. I hope that clarifies things. Yeah.
Thanks for, is it me? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. And you just mentioned algorithmic justice, and you talked about AI bias, algorithmic bias during your talk. I just wanted to ask you, what do you define by justice, and how can we navigate algorithmic bias if we don't have a single definition of justice and fairness? And then according to which, you know, values do we want to evaluate our AI models? Is it according to Western values, or is it according to some other sort of values? Like, how would you? I'm just like challenging you here.
No, yeah, I think that's an amazing question. I was just giving a panel. I was on a panel last night with Pride in Tech in London, and we were literally talking the entire panel about those questions you were asking. You know, like, how do you define justice, and how do we ensure that algorithms are democratized moving forward, right? Especially with rapid innovation, and regulations are always going to be 10 years behind. You know, tech is always innovating at a pace faster than humans can keep up. How do you define justice? Is it like with Gemini, when they had, you know, they had, I think it was like AI generated images of SS soldiers and they were black and brown. Is that justice? I don't think so. But it's definitely one of the ways that, you know, there's like a colorblind sort of like white liberal model to apply there. I don't have the ultimate answer. I would say that justice is at the very least being representative of the populations that you're serving, right? Or that you're claiming to be representative of. I think algorithms need to be transparent, and that we need to work towards data sovereignty. And I also am a big proponent of the localization of algorithmic development. And what I mean by that is communities being in control of developing their own sort of models for serving that community's needs. And I again go back to the example of the, you know, indigenous people sort of using AI to help them with passing on their traditional language and teaching the traditional language so it's not lost, and sort of really sovereignty and transparency. Is that really a full definition of justice that can be enshrined into law? I don't think so, but I think it's a start, right? And I think that a lot of these questions, they're open questions because we don't have, we have no idea where tech will develop, right? People were freaking out about, you know, Bitcoin and whatnot like 10 years ago. But I think really the remaining theme is that, you know, tech will constantly be innovating rapidly, and it will spark a lot of fear because it's disruptive to society. And really what determines the path that it goes is, as I was talking to Professor Hotta earlier, it's about who really has control over shaping its course. And I think it's important that people who care and people who are compassionate and marginalized communities are at the forefront of that. And I think that is where we can really find a more full definition and realization of justice.
So we have one question online. So maybe I think you were having a question. I'll take one online, and then I see two questions in the back there.
Thank you. I do have two questions, hopefully easier than the last one. First question, how do you define decolonization? And the second question is, there's evidence of cultural bias in LLMs, like they tend to be a little bit more like free expression oriented, more secular, so like kind of like Swedish vibes. And I'm wondering what you view as most promising. That, like, suppose we're interested in having more regionally like culturally adapted models, or even locally culturally adapted models. What do you have any views on what the best, most promising methods are for cultural adaptation of LLMs?
That's a super interesting question. Yeah, I think. So I think this is where we get into this really interesting, almost like really abstract sort of theoretical sphere where we talk about, what's the difference between traditional culture versus social culture, right? And this is something coming from the Chinese and American context I've thought about a lot. I think I personally I think that LLMs are at their best when they're adapting to each individual rather than sort of applying blanket models to everyone. And so ChatGPT recently had this option where you could tell it how you want it to respond to you. And I think that's quite helpful because obviously, outside of our communities, we are also unique people and we need to have, different kinds of conversations with these LLMs. I also think that there are lots of really interesting ways that ChatGPT has developed in the educational sense. And this is sort of a tangent from your question. But the other night at the panel, there was a man who talked about his son who has Asperger's, who usually it gets overstimulated in classes, but he realized that he can ask ChatGPT questions about class topics that he didn't understand or the teacher didn't sort of explain really well to him, and he could learn in that sort of context. And I think that points towards something really helpful that I think ChatGPT can sort of supplement a lot of missing areas that maybe your existing environment is not really fulfilling. And I think that's sort of a direction for how to structure how LLMs, respond to you. I think that's a really great sort of framework to take. I don't know if that answers your question.
And your definition of decolonization.
Oh, right. This really harkens back to the justice question. So I would define decolonization as attempting to, I wouldn't say make up, but I would say attempting to correct for biases introduced by colonization, right? And so in the NLP sense, this would be cultural biases. So an overemphasis on European languages is one example, and so really trying to recenter the margins, as Bell Hooks said in a lot of her prominent works. And I think this goes back to what I said about justice too. It's about recentering the narrative, and that's how I would view decolonization.
Thanks.
Okay, I'll take the question from online. We've got Amadea here who's put two questions in. One is, what steps can researchers and developers take to ensure that AI advancements are nearly inclusive? By the way, I'm an Indonesian speaker and I mostly agree with this decolonization topic. Then he follows up also to say, how do you see future of decolonized AI, NLP, ML? Will you see more independent region-specific models?
Okay, well, thank you so much, Amadia, for the wonderful questions. Yeah, so funnily enough, I was also talking about this last night. I think there are, so I touched on this in the presentation as well, but I think there's a sort of two-pronged sort of approach that can be taken. So one is that, we're diversifying the teams that are developing these AI models and algorithms, right? People who are leading, people who are developing the algorithms, they are representative of, the communities that we're trying to include that have been historically marginalized. And then another is that we're codifying specific structures and policies in place so that even if the teams aren't diverse enough, you still have to take steps to make sure that your algorithms are not being harmful. So one example is ensuring that test data that we're using for training algorithms are diverse enough, that they're representative of, populations that have been marginalized, and that, you're sort of running the necessary training on them, including adversarial training if necessary, to make sure that algorithms are equitable and inclusive. And so one is more structural and then one is more, from the I would say the backstage of who's developing these algorithms. And how do I see the future of decolonized AI, NLP, and ML? Will we see more independent region-specific models? I think we have already started seeing more independent region-specific models, and I hate to use DeepSeek as an example, but it is an example. It's a bigger example because China's really big as well, and I wouldn't say it's a low-income country anymore, it's a middle-income country. But I think there's a lot of hope for more open source models, more region and culturally specific models being developed as more marginalized communities are joining in. And as we see that, you know, obviously ChatGPT has a lot of issues, but just the implementation of large language models everywhere has made information extremely accessible and democratized a lot of you know, this knowledge that used to be held captive by the ivory tower. And so I think there's a lot of hope there in terms of, you know, there a lot of resistance, you know, especially from the global south in terms of directing where AI models are going and who they're serving. At the same time, there's always going to be pushback. You know, we also see like just now, like American corporations have been attacking DeepSeek. That's just one example, and DeepSeek is huge too, right? It's driven by like a really big Chinese company, and a lot of other global southern countries might not have that same kind of economic power. But I think there will always be resistance, and I hope that we see more region, you know, region-specific local models being developed. And I do believe that there will be. I also believe that it will be sort of an uphill battle, but it's still a really worthy fight.
Okay, so we've got two questions in the back, and then I'm not sure. Okay, if you're okay to start, and then
a really short comment adding on his question. First of all, thank you. It was really interesting, and I've been studying decolonial theory from a legal perspective, so decolonial public law, and one of the core elements is that you have to like deconstruct all the core concepts that we have around. So you can't rely on a single definition of justice. You can, you have to like entrench complexity also in defining concepts. So it's impossible to define one single like conception of justice, of democracy, and of human rights, for example. So I think that's also to like add to the previous comment is something that is crucial also in the knowledge production that will entail all this innovation in the tech field. So
yeah, thank you for that comment. I completely agree.
just the speaker next. Yeah.
My comment goes more towards like the practicality of like actually implementing like decolonization in practice. So that would require like, you know, lots of countries in global south like having to acquire some amounts of technology. Like is very much like all the data is already labeled by people in the global south in the first place for these models, right? So I'm a believer it might not even be a data issue, but it's just like actual access to capital to like train models. It's not a surprise that the first model to come out like is from China. That's competitive with OpenAI and the like. So my question is like, is it not just like we're just people in the global south are just being priced out of actually being able to train models, and probably only countries like China are actually going to be able to benefit from this kind of boom because it's so expensive to actually train these models. And DeepSeek itself, like the company behind it is like a hedge fund. So there's like a correlation between capital and the ability to even train these models. So even if I'm just questioning the whole element of decolonization in it because it still revolves around this high capital barrier like for entry.
No, thank you so much for that really important point. Yeah, I think something to note though is that DeepSeek was trained on extremely cheap algorithms compared to ChatGPT. But I mean, you're right that there's still a really, you know, it's really capital intensive still. And I think I'm more of an optimist in this sense, in that I think decolonization, it can still be integrated in ways that aren't necessarily complete, but it's a start, right? So in terms of the cultural sphere, making sure that the models are actually reflecting global populations, whether or not we can see region-specific AI models being sort of developed at a rate that is actually, you know, really equitable from the ground up. I think that is a question, and that's continued to be a question in the post-colonial era, right? It's just something that we have to grapple with constantly, because the reality is that through a lot of resource expropriation, many regions in the world don't have capital to, not just develop tech, but to even have access to internet a lot of times, which is what a lot of my PhD research is on, digital gender circularity and women's access to the internet in the global South. And that's an issue that goes beyond just tech alone. It really is about, it's just what he was saying before, is it's about justice in this really, sort of full and very heavy sense of the word.
Yeah.
So my question is related to diversity and justice and even decolonization. But nowadays, like we hear a lot about like diversity, justice on the level of different languages, so English, Chinese. But I'm curious, like if this the conversation have been happening on like within language. So within the big umbrella of English, there's like standard English, which is more like white American or British male kind of English versus Black English, and how like people like there's been research done, like ChatGPT will describe this potential speaker of Black English as lazy and not useful compared to like praising the kind of white English speakers. So if we are going to like make a kind of Chinese version of MPL or ML, who should be on the table to determine what kind of Chinese we are using, if that makes sense. And especially since like nowadays the frequently used Chinese is Mandarin, but it itself is kind of
It's a dialect.
colonial,
Yeah.
or it, but that maybe colonial is not really the right word, but it's definitely kind
Hegemonic.
of like silencing very much like other kind of Chinese. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing point. And I mean, I think everyone has raised really amazing points today, but yeah, I think that the people at the table should be, like I said, they should be representative of communities that have been historically marginalized, and especially in the English context too, when we're talking about like racist and classist sort of interpretations of what is proper and not proper English, right? It's extremely important that NLP is being adapted to, not just adapted, but actually changed to be inclusive and centering marginalized practices. And I'm not an expert in the English area, but in terms of Chinese, absolutely, it should be inclusive of marginalized dialects, and it also should be a tool, just like I was talking about with indigenous languages, that AI should be a tool to help preserve these languages rather than erase them. And I remember I was watching this really interesting video, like I think it was a year ago, about this young woman who was trying to preserve the Suzhou dialect, and it's a really beautiful dialect. But there's not really written structure to it. It doesn't really, correlate directly to or translate directly to a lot of, Han characters today. And I remember thinking at the time, if there was, because she was handwriting a lot of the stuff that her grandmother would teach her. And I had another, roommate at Columbia who was working on preserving the Hokkien dialect from the Jiangxi province, which the Hokkien dialect has like 20 different branches, right? And I think a lot about how, I think NLP and technology, it really can be such an immensely powerful tool for preserving these dialects if they're localized, right? And so to answer your question, I think the communities themselves should be in charge of the algorithms, and they should definitely have a seat at the decision table.
Right. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. And actually, the last question links a lot to my own experience, because in my household, like 5 different dialects of Chinese is spoken, and sometimes I struggle to talk to my grandparents because they don't speak Mandarin. And also, when my grandparents go to hospitals, the doctors speak Mandarin, they don't speak Mandarin, and it's causing a lot of problems. And I see potential in LLM to sort of act as this voice-to-voice translator between different dialects. But one sort of worry that I've always had is that we won't have enough investor or developer interest in this tech, and from a capitalist perspective, they would just wait out this elderly generation, and then the new generation will speak Mandarin. But I was wondering what you think, especially I mean, I really appreciate the work that you are doing with at NOM. But I was just wondering, like, what do you think of the future of this?
Do you mean impact-oriented tech?
Sort of like impact, I guess, incorporating more local dialects into LIM. I do think it's really important, and as you've stressed, like with indigenous languages, because they are indigenous languages in China and they're kind of being erased by the central government. Yeah, but I don't see enough developer interest, but I don't know what you think about them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to that that person's question as well, about sort of the distribution of capital, right? And justice, because we are living in this sort of post-colonial capitalist society. It's not something that, you know, any of us can really have an answer to. But I think like with Hmong, right? So we have a digital buddy that uses AI to essentially guide grandparents through like each step of different smartphone functions. So they ask like, oh, how do I send a text to my granddaughter? The app will basically just walk them through every step. And they're basically, you know, supplementing the absence of a young relative, because a lot of us are so busy that we can't be with our older relatives, right? So it's essentially a digital buddy. It's sort of filling in a gap. And I think that's one of the really beautiful use cases of AI, is that it can actually become a helpful hand in maintaining human-to-human relation rather than replacing it. And I think the example of you know, developing dialects, to, you know, algorithms to remember these dialects, in terms of, I think it's important, and I really want to see it become more and more mainstream. But unfortunately, I also think just realistically, the people who are going to get attention for developing these algorithms need to have some sort of backing by capital. And in China, especially because we see venture capital in China is really conservative and really, really hard tech centric. And even, I wouldn't say even more, but definitely very male dominated and not really interested in DEI the way that European countries might be more so. I think the barrier to entry is even higher. But I know that in the European ecosystem, there is a lot of impact-oriented venture capital, you know, LGBTQ-oriented venture capital, and I have a lot of friends in that space and who are really passionate about, you know, obviously it's still profit-driven and there's still a lot of problems with venture capital as a whole, but you know, they have a mission focus to what they invest in, and I think that's a really great sort of pathway forward. I think it's hard to predict what would happen, but I think the likelihood of something like you mentioned, if you're a developer, you should, you know, definitely pursue it. I think the likelihood of it being invested in outside of China is quite high, and connecting it with people in China. But again, it sort of goes back to your network capital and who you know. But I'm happy to talk further.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But kind of at time,
Just one-
if it's really quick,
Yeah,
because
just
it's,
to add on to this topic, I think last year there's actually like several AI models that deal with dialects, and it's led by the government. I think one is by Telecom, and it said that it can master 30 kind of language dialects in China. So worth checking out.
thanks a lot for the really inspiring talk, and thank you very much for a great discussion, everyone.